Hi, everyone. Tonight, we're going to talk about what enslaved people in ancient Rome did every day, and more specifically, what their owners weren't allowed to do to them. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Please tell me in the comments where you are and what time it is. It's always interesting to see who's joining us from around the world. Let's start to relax tonight. First, turn off the bright lights and turn on a fan to make it feel cooler. It's like asking what a toddler can't do with a crayon and a white wall. There are rules about this. In reality, it's all a bit chaotic. Let's start with the legal definitions because that always gets things started. In ancient Rome, a slave wasn't considered a person. They were officially defined as res, a Latin word meaning thing. Not a person with limited rights or an underpaid intern. That's not the issue. It is the same legal category as a bench, a decorative urn, or a goat with anxiety. Roman owners treated them in the same way. You could beat them, sell them, rent them out, brand them, gamble them away, or give them as a gift. You could even send them to fight in the arena. But to be fair, some people like that better than folding laundry for a senator's wife who had trust issues. But despite this amazing opportunity, the Romans eventually realized that some limits might be helpful. It's not because they found empathy. That's ridiculous. It's because killing your workers is not very efficient. Slaves who have died cannot serve wine, pay taxes, or clean up after other dead slaves. So laws appeared slowly and awkwardly, like a distant uncle at a wedding no one invited. The first limits were more like suggestions written in invisible ink. For example, if your slave died in a strange way, like falling into a sword 17 times, there might be a trial or not. It depends on who you knew. If you were important enough, you could claim he tripped during a very intense game of dice, and no one would be surprised. Eventually, emperors like Hadrian, the one who built the wall, not the razor, introduced reforms that said you couldn't kill a slave without a good reason. That was the reason almost every time. He annoyed me, but hey, it was a start. In short, yes, there were some things owners couldn't do, but those things were buried under a mountain of things they could. Roman law technically protected slaves, but it was like an umbrella protecting you in a hurricane. It was there, but you couldn't count on it. In ancient Rome, if you wanted to kill your slave, you didn't need to give a reason. A bad haircut, making eye contact at the wrong time, serving you slightly warm wine, they should be fired. The law didn't change its mind. After all, it wasn't murder if the victim was a piece of property. Who hasn't wanted to wreck their stuff after a long day? But by the time the empire was ready to take on more responsibility, the Romans had already decided that having toilets indoors was a good idea. At this point, things became a little more organized, but not in a kind way. Killing your own slave could mean legal problems. These are not necessarily bad results, but results all the same. Then Emperor Hadrian appeared. He was known for building walls and changing slave laws. He was also known for not being tolerant of scandals. He passed a law that said, hey, maybe let's not randomly murder the household staff, unless we ask nicely first. Now, owners needed to go through a magistrate to get state approval before they could kill a slave because justice, it seems, is best served by bureaucracy. But the law was not always enforced. If you were rich and well-dressed, the magistrates didn't ask you any questions. If you weren't, congratulations. Your trial would be held just after the next chariot race and long before it was important. But it was still against the law to kill a slave without a proper trial. This means that at some point, a Roman lawyer had to explain to a client that even if a slave overcooked a mouse, crucifixion was not the right punishment. The reason for this legal change wasn't to help people. It was about managing the crowd. Romans had already seen what happened when slaves got too angry. Spartacus and his friends weren't exactly polite. The state realized that even if they couldn't stop cruelty, they could at least reduce the attention it got. which often led to things like torches and heads on pikes. Killing your slave was still possible, but it meant more paperwork and your neighbors might get angry. Murder wasn't banned. It was just gently discouraged, like clapping between symphony movements. Progress in the Roman style. Let's talk about a difficult and uncomfortable topic that is important to history. This is about how Roman slave owners treated the personal boundaries of the people they owned. Spoiler alert, boundaries weren't exactly Rome's strong point. These were people who built baths for 300 people and said that this was their time. In ancient Roman law, a slave was not considered a person in the legal sense. This meant that the idea of bodily autonomy didn't really apply. Owners could impose themselves physically, not just through work, but in more personal and private ways without any need for consent, consequence, or moral justification. It wasn't written down as a law because it wasn't necessary. Just as you wouldn't expect to find a law in ancient Rome that said you couldn't borrow your own sandals, there were no rules about whether a master could demand sexual services from their slave. It was just assumed that this was part of the deal. This was true for all kinds of people, including women and young slaves, who were seen as beautiful additions to the homes of rich people. These people were often given jobs where it was expected that they would entertain guests. This entertainment could be anything from singing to playing music to making sure the wine never ran out. Were there any protections in place? If a different owner caused your slave a lot of harm, you could sue them for the damage to the property. Yes, it's not about the person, it's about the damage to the asset. The Roman courts were more interested in depreciation than dignity. Later emperors, particularly in the Christian era, started making unclear laws that encouraged people to be moral and modest, at least in theory. But these reforms came late in the empire's history and were more about how things looked than making sure the reforms were actually being followed. If anything, they were like putting a fig leaf on a statue and calling it progress. In short, there were virtually no laws to protect slaves from being exploited in this area. It wasn't just common. It was a system where even if you resisted, you would be punished more severely than the abuse itself. Yes, it's dark, but it's important to understand these realities. I'm not trying to make Rome look good, but to show what happens when power is not controlled. Yes, marriage is a very important union between two people. In Rome, it was also a way of combining property, status, and in-laws who might own gladiators. But what did this important institution mean for slaves? Not much. Roman slaves couldn't get married legally. But that doesn't mean they didn't fall in love, live together, or have children. They definitely did. In fact, some long-term relationships among enslaved people were as committed as any Roman senator's fourth marriage, which, let's be honest, was usually more about money than love. But according to Roman law, these unions weren't considered marriages. They were called contubernium. This is a word that sounds like something you'd put ointment on, but actually referred to a sort of unofficial domestic partnership. Imagine a common law marriage, but without the legal recognition or the associated rights and privacy. Owners sometimes allowed these pairings, and sometimes even encouraged them, especially if the resulting offspring would be born into slavery and help with the work in the house. You get two for the price of one, and the product is guaranteed to last a lifetime. But there's a catch. The master could end it at any moment. Sell one partner, reassign them, or marry them off elsewhere. A slave couple could live together for decades, have children, and still be torn apart because one was needed in Sicily to work on the backs of slaves, while the other was needed in Gaul to mop the floor. Did enslaved people ask for their partnerships to be recognized? Sometimes, in rare cases, especially when one or both people got divorced later, their marriage could be recognized by the law, like getting a marriage certificate years after the divorce. Isn't that nice? Owners could even marry their slaves via contubernium, which would make things even more awkward. But it wasn't a legal marriage, just a mix of power, ownership, and convenience. Love stories. These were not. Imagine working in a house for 20 years, raising kids, cleaning, and fetching grapes, and then overhearing your boss call you the tall one with the limp. That's not just rude. This was normal for Romans. In ancient Rome, a slave's identity could be changed like a piece of clay in a potter's hands. If the potter was impatient, a bit controlling, and didn't believe in last names. Slaves had names, but these were often given by their masters, changed for no reason, or taken away completely. Imagine deleting someone's entire Google profile and replacing it with Steve number 4. You could be born with a beautiful Greek name like Callista, meaning most beautiful. But by the time you've been sold twice and moved to a different area, you'd be called Spatula because someone thought it was funny. And unlike today's celebrities, you couldn't change your image. You couldn't request something elegant like Aurora or Maximus Prime. You got what you were given. Even worse, the Roman system did not fully recognize the humanity of slaves in legal or social terms. Your function, not your heritage, beliefs, or talents, defined who you were. Were you good at cooking? You were a cousin. Did you manage the accounts? Dispensator. Have you ever made a mistake with the laundry? That idiot. If you were really good at something or had a lot of education, like a Greek philosopher who taught Roman kids, people might respect you a bit. You might want to keep your original name, but don't get complacent. If you have a bad day, you might feel like you're back to being number 12. Roman satire even made fun of this, showing households where every slave had the same name just to make things easier for the owner. Davis, get the wine. 5 men would show up. If you were too slow, you would be punished. The rest were punished before they had even done anything wrong, just in case. Could Roman slave owners erase your name, history, and identity? Absolutely. The only thing harder than escaping slavery was escaping the nickname you got after sneezing on a senator. And if you ever did gain your freedom, well, good news, you got to keep your master's family name. Because nothing says freedom like being tied to the person who used to own you. Picture a Roman villa with marble columns and a fountain shaped like a sea god vomiting water. In the back room, a slave is teaching a senator's son how to recite Homer in flawless Greek. That's right. Not all slaves had to dig trenches or carry lamoury. Some were expected to share knowledge, preferably in the form of an enemy hexameter poem. It is strange to think about education for enslaved people. At the time, slaves were legally considered to be property. On the other hand, some people were expected to be walking encyclopedias, fluent in multiple languages, skilled in rhetoric, philosophy, medicine, and even law. And no, they didn't pay him more, they just made it slightly less likely that he would be sold to someone worse. Greek slaves were especially popular as tutors. Why? Rome was very interested in Greek culture. Romans basically said, "We conquered you, but could you also help our kids sound smarter at parties?" A Greek slave might be teaching boring teenagers about Latin literature during the day and fetching sandals by night. But let's not think this is a kind act. Owners didn't educate their slaves because they were kind. They educated them because an educated slave was useful. If you had an expert in your household, like a scribe, tutor, or physician, you're not just given status points. You could also charge your rich neighbors for his services. Education was less about learning and more about making money. This created some strange power struggles. Imagine being smarter than your master, but still having to ask permission to go outside. Many of these people were intellectuals, but they were treated like talking books. Could a slave learn things by themselves? Technically, yes, but only if they weren't too busy cleaning the floors or renting out the venue for birthday parties. But any personal development had to serve the interests of the owner. Slaves who wanted to learn were not given library cards. There is even a famous case of Epictetus, a Stoic philosopher and former slave who taught resilience and virtue while literally being someone's property. That's what happened in ancient Rome. You can find out about yourself, but only if your owner says it's okay. Now we arrive at one of the most difficult legal problems of ancient Rome. Could a slave actually take legal action against their master? Let me explain. Yes, in the same way a hamster might challenge its owner to chess. It's possible, but you'd better hope your opponent is feeling unusually generous or very distracted. Roman law was very complicated, but it did allow some slaves to make complaints against their masters. One option was to ask for permission to do something or to ask the emperor directly. A slave could beg for help from statues of the emperor or government officials. This was a brave decision, especially because the average slave did not have any legal training. In practice, these petitions were only used in the most extreme cases of abuse. We're talking about physical brutality, sexual exploitation that even Rome would find shocking or dangerous neglect. If your boss tried to set you on fire for forgetting the honey cakes, you might have a case. But don't forget to trim the laurel hedge. I'm sorry, Decimus. There was another option that was almost legal. This was to appeal to the aediles. The aediles were Roman magistrates. They were responsible for things like market regulation and public order. Some of the slaves who were hired out in marketplaces, often the more useful types, such as cooks, writers, and entertainers, could, in theory, make complaints to the authorities about being mistreated by their temporary employers. But again, this was less about justice and more about keeping Rome's reputation as a city of order and dignity. If the slaves were treated very badly, they could complain. This would make Rome look bad. Otherwise, it's back to work. It's also interesting to note that the law of the lash, which gave masters the right to beat their slaves, had some unclear limits. Some emperors, like Hadrian, tried to stop cruelty, but what was considered cruel changed over time. If the slave died while being tortured, the judge might frown. If they just limped for life, you'd shrug and think, oh well. Ancient Rome wasn't exactly famous for kindness, but even in its vast system of control, cruelty, and bureaucracy, there was one small possibility of freedom. That's the fancy Latin word for freedom. You might be surprised to learn that this was something slaves could actually achieve. So, what were some of the things that Roman slave owners couldn't do? They couldn't take away a slave's legal right to hope for freedom. They might beat you, change your name to Moppicus, and make you serve wine at awkward dinner parties. But they couldn't stop you from being free once the legal process was available. Even in a system where people were considered property, Rome maintained a weirdly bureaucratic optimism about people being able to move up in society. If you were lucky, loyal, and could read, there were 3 ways to free slaves. You could do it with a legal ceremony, or you could do it through a will. The third way was to give them their freedom in return for really good service. It's like getting a gold star from your boss, but you get your whole life back as a reward. There were rules, of course. Rome loved rules. For example, you couldn't just free a whole crowd of slaves at once. That would upset the social order. A lot of people with big dreams and clean intentions are dangerous. There are also quotas. A master with 3 slaves could only free 2 at a time, which feels less like justice and more like an ancient version of you can pick one friend to come inside. Also, you wouldn't be able to free someone if you had debt or were legally incompetent. So yes, even slaves had to worry about their master's poor credit rating. But there's more to it. When a slave was set free, they became a freedman or a freedwoman. They weren't full citizens, but they had rights. They could own property and even own slaves. It's a bit like escaping prison and then opening your own prison. But this legal window, however small, gave enslaved people something that no master could destroy: a structured, lawful chance at freedom. Yes, it might take 20 years of always being obedient, not saying no, and folding your master's tunic the right way, but there was hope. Not really. In Rome, hope was sometimes all you had. That, and maybe a slightly less rude nickname, if you were lucky. At first, the Roman Republic was a place where slave owners had a lot of power. Slap, whip, and rename you bucketheads. Sell you at the market next to a donkey with a better dental plan. Nothing special. But Rome eventually decided that killing a slave was a line they shouldn't cross. In the old days, the Roman boss, who was like the dad, could kill a slave without even filling out a form. After all, slaves were seen as property. You won't get in trouble for breaking your own vase, even if it could talk, bleed, and knew your favorite bedtime story. But as the empire grew, the emperors realized that slaves were very important to the economy. They were also very useful as tutors, accountants, and barbers. The laws began to change a little. Things started changing under Emperor Hadrian, the one known for his wool. He decided that masters could not kill their slaves without a trial. This wasn't because Hadrian was weak. It was because killing trained, skilled slaves was bad for business. A dead slave didn't earn money, cut hair, or make funny faces for the people eating dinner. Later, Emperor Antoninus Pius made it even clearer. If you kill a slave without a good reason, the state might see it as murder. That's right, legal consequences. You couldn't just casually murder your cook for burning the garum sauce and expect to be congratulated. You might have to explain what you did to a judge in public, with a lawyer there to represent you. This didn't mean that slave owners suddenly became kind, but it did create a strange legal situation. Slaves couldn't take their owners to court just because they'd given them slap. But if the owner got too violent, the state might get involved. Why did they change it? It's partly about right and wrong, but mostly about money. Rome realized that it was bad for business to let people destroy valuable human resources. Imagine it's like the ancient Roman version of HR compliance training. In ancient Rome, if you were a free citizen and owned a slave, there was one thing the law said you couldn't do: marrying them. That's right. You could ask them to clean your back, name your children, and maybe even ghostwrite your poetry. But getting married, that's a big deal. Roman marriage, or connubium, was a civic institution reserved for free people. Because slaves were legally seen as property, they weren't allowed to take part in these events, just like a plow or a very tired horse. There will be no exchanging of rings, no awkward speeches from uncles, and definitely no romantic honeymoons in Pompeii. But this is Rome we're talking about. If there's a way around it, we'll find it. So, while marriage was not allowed, owners could enter into a de facto relationship with their slaves, especially if the slave was attractive, talented, or really good at pouring wine. These were common, even boring. Romans even had a word for it: contubernium, which means tent sharing. It sounded more like a camping trip, but it was essentially a long-term partnership where both people had slightly fewer legal rights and slightly more power in the relationship. In these relationships, the slave was still seen as the owner's property, but they might live with the owner, have their children, and essentially act as a spouse in all but official documents. If the mother was a slave, the kids were slaves too. This is a plan that has been set up for them, but there are conditions. But if the master really cared about their reputation, the laws about inheritance, or just felt bad, they could free the slave and marry them. It's a legal solution. But of course, this meant more paperwork, manumission fees, and probably a very awkward conversation at the next fancy dinner party. Ah yes, Gas married his housekeeper. No, after he set her free. That's very good. They're registered now. I also gave her a nice name. Julius something or other. In a society that was obsessed with status, marrying a former slave was risky. Some people might think it's silly, but the law said that once she was free, she could be punished. Even if you were the most intelligent person in Rome, speaking Greek, an expert in accounting, able to recite Cicero backwards while juggling AI, you would still never be allowed to run for public office. Not even something boring like street lantern supervisor, because even though slaves were the backbone of Roman society, they weren't considered full humans in the legal sense. They were more like highly durable, multilingual furniture. And Rome, which was always focused on dignity, decided that its political offices should only be filled by men who were born free, and preferably by those with a certain number of ancestors who had not been bought as slaves. This meant that slave owners couldn't make their cleverest slave senator, even if they were better at speaking than the local rich man, who still thought the Punic Wars were ongoing. The logic was that public office was a privilege of libertas, full Roman freedom. It was connected to honor, family name, and a strong, unhealthy interest in togris. Slaves could work for public officials and often did. Sometimes they were in charge of running a whole estate or managing the finances. But they could never own the property. Even former slaves who had become free men and had become partially citizens were still not allowed to have many high-ranking positions. They might own land, start businesses, and wear less itchy tunics, but the Roman authorities still didn't trust them. You used to pour wine for a senator last year, and now you want to be one. Let's not get too excited. But here's the surprising part. Many rich Romans relied heavily on their highly educated slaves to do the actual work. Do you need a speech written? Send it to your Greek slave. Do you need a library managed? Your slave copier's got it. Do you need to handle a bribe? Secretly? Who better to represent someone who doesn't officially exist in court? But even the most intelligent slave could never become a public leader until they were free. It was like being the ghostwriter for a best-selling book, but never getting credit for it. So, masters couldn't officially turn their slaves into consuls or censors, but they could, and often did, let them manage everything except the spotlight, because Rome was fine with slaves being the brains behind the curtain, as long as no one noticed. You might think that if a slave saw a murder in ancient Rome, the courts would quickly want to hear what they said, ask them some questions, and give them a free glass of weak wine. But Rome had other ideas. In Roman law, slaves weren't allowed to give evidence in court. It wasn't because they had a poor memory or didn't know who had stabbed who at dinner. It was because they were considered too untrustworthy to tell the truth unless you first made them. Yes, you read that right. In ancient Rome, if you wanted a slave to speak in court, the best way to do that was to torture them. After all, what better way to get justice than a screaming witness? Roman lawyers thought that slaves would lie to protect their owners. This is not completely wrong, because if you're a slave, your whole life depends on the will of the person who owns you. Instead of counting on people to be honest, they use tools like hot irons and lashes that sound like they're from the Middle Ages. A few hundred years before the Middle Ages even began, this caused a legal problem. Slaves weren't allowed to be forced to give evidence against their master. If they were willing to, that would also be suspicious. So, the courts decided to make people honest by making them feel pain. It's not exactly the Socratic method. You might be wondering if there were any exceptions. Yes, sometimes if a slave had been freed, or if the matter didn't involve their master directly, they could give evidence voluntarily. But if the trial involved the owner, forget it. People thought, they'll lie unless we make them. Literally, this wasn't just cruel, it was very inconsistent. Imagine trying to build a case using a witness who couldn't give evidence unless they were mid-scream. It's like asking a parrot to sing the national anthem while it is being electrocuted. You might get something, but probably not what you deserve. So, in theory, slave owners couldn't legally force their slaves to give honest court testimony. Not unless they had them brought in and let the state do the torturing, which, strangely, was seen as a type of fair investigation. In ancient Rome, Lady Justice was not blind. She just didn't want to hear it unless it came with a bruise. Even though slaves were considered legal property in ancient Rome, they had a surprisingly high degree of economic freedom. Imagine being treated like a talking lamp, but being allowed to sell homemade olive oil on the weekends. That's the Roman paradox. While masters owned their slaves, they didn't necessarily control every penny. Slaves could save money for themselves. This money was called a peculi. It was like an unofficial allowance, a tip jar, or a secret money stash. The money technically still belonged to the master, but it was often left alone as long as the slave wasn't using it to fund a rebellion or a spa day. And here's where things get awkward for people who like to control everything in Rome. Eventually, slaves could use this special property to buy their own freedom. Yes, a slave could pay their master to stop owning them. It's a bit like working full-time for a man who locks you in the cellar and using your paycheck to politely bribe him into unlocking the door. Hello, sir. I've been saving money by doing small jobs and living on what I can get, and I don't want to be your property anymore. Here is your receipt. Was this the right thing to do? Not quite. Roman law didn't automatically free slaves, and a master could refuse to free them if they felt they had been mistreated or had become too fond of giving orders. But many masters liked the idea of looking merciful and getting paid, so they accepted it. This created a strange dynamic. The master couldn't stop a slave from earning money as long as they did so legally. They couldn't take the special case unless they wanted to look dishonorable. In Roman society, it was seen as worse to appear dishonorable than to be stabbed. Some of them even managed estates, handled business accounts, or ran shops. This meant they knew more about the economy than their owners, who were often too busy relaxing in their homes and misquoting Virgil. But a master could still cancel the special status at any time. But doing this too often made them look cheap, like someone who steals ideas from other people, so most people played it cool. So, even though masters had the advantage, they couldn't stop a clever slave from gradually building a stronger hand over time. If you think ancient Rome gave slave owners total control over their lives, you'd be almost right, except when it came to religion. Even in a society where a man could legally name his dog Caesar and sell his slave 3 times to pay his taxes, there were still limits. One of the limits was this. A master could not stop a slave from taking part in religious activities, especially those involving household gods or less. These weren't well-known gods like Jupiter or Mars, who had thunderbolts and statues made for them. No, these were simple household spirits, a bit like smoke alarms, whose job was to keep the home peaceful and the kitchen from catching fire. In every Roman household, no matter how much conflict there was in it, had a special place for them. Even slaves were expected to take part in daily rituals honoring the layers. They lit a little incense, said a prayer, and offered some food. It was just your standard, please don't let this house collapse today kind of thing. If a slave was not allowed to have these basic rights, it would have seemed strange. It would have been like not letting someone sing happy birthday at their own party. Roman religion was about tradition and public image as much as it was about actual belief. And having your slaves take part in the rituals showed that your household was well-ordered and religious and not going to be punished by the gods. Let's be honest, even the strictest master didn't want to upset the gods of the household. These were spirits who watched you eat, sleep, and sometimes yell at your accountant. You didn't risk that kind of supernatural control just to make a point. Some slaves even had their own household gods, called lervals, and would perform their own small personal rituals. It was one of the few places in Roman life where a slave could express something close to identity or at least try to prevent another plumbing disaster. So while a master could control most aspects of a slave body and work to please the local spirits, they generally didn't get involved. Even gods and goddesses had their limits in Rome. Even though Roman slave owners were powerful and important and had huge statues of themselves on coins, they had one big weakness: public embarrassment. In Roman society, a person's dignity, reputation, and general image as a respectable toga wearer mattered more than gold, goats, or military victories combined. And nothing undermined that precious social status, quite like being dragged into a scandal involving the people who literally cleaned your chamber pot. This meant that, whether it was legal or not, there were things owners simply didn't do to their slaves. This wasn't because they suddenly became ethical, but because the Roman public could be very judgmental. The mob, the Senate, even your dinner guests could ruin you more quickly than a badly timed vomitorium incident. For example, imagine a Roman nobleman who punished his whole household of slaves for a crime committed by just one of them. It was actually allowed at the time. Collective punishment was a thing. But people were so angry about what happened, the Senate even thought about passing new laws to stop this kind of thing happening again in the future. Roman Twitter, also known as shouting in the forum, was not happy. And remember the power of infamia. This is when a master's bad behavior can affect their reputation. It could make them look bad in the eyes of the law and in society. This could happen if they were cruel, exploitative, or just very vocal about how awful they were. If you're the kind of guy who whips his slaves for mispronouncing Latin, your reputation might end up worse than a disgraced charioteer and with fewer female fans. In fact, being seen as a good or kind boss became a sort of status. Masters would perform random acts of kindness, like freeing a slave in public, giving someone a special permission, or letting them marry just to show off how good they were. In the Mongol Empire, a Khan's harem was more than just a private collection of lovers. It was a symbol of empire. Imagine a huge tent or palace full of women from every corner of Eurasia. Each one was chosen not only for how beautiful they were, but also for what they represented. To the Mongols, having a concubine, a secret mistress, was as much about politics as it was about pleasure. They were walking trophies of conquest, showing that the Khan's authority reached far beyond the steppes. A harem could contain dozens, sometimes even hundreds of women. These women could be anything from noble daughters of rival rulers to slaves captured during raids. Each arrival sent a message. If the Khan had a Persian prince's daughter or a Chinese governor's son in his court, it wasn't just about having friends. It was a way of showing who was in charge. This meant that the Mongols weren't just beating up armies. They took their enemies into their homes, their families, and even their future royal families. This wasn't just a thing with the Mongols. Many empires kept harems, but the scale and symbolism here were better. For rulers who were always on the move, the harem was a way to show their power to foreign ambassadors. Going into the king's court and seeing women from their country sitting with other people was both amazing and embarrassing. It was a reminder that the Khan could command loyalty, tribute, and even intimacy from lands thousands of miles away. Concubines also made it hard to tell the difference between politics and family. Some women disappeared into obscurity, living unassuming lives within the harem. But others became well-known, using charm, cunning, or being a mum to gain influence. If a concubine had a son, her life might suddenly change. Her child could become the next ruler. This meant that harems became like small political battlefields where rivalries, alliances, and betrayals happened as intensely as they did on the battlefield. For the Mongols, war was not just about taking over land. It was about changing societies so that the people living in them were changed too. When the horsemen rode into Persia, Russia, or northern China, they didn't just take gold, livestock, and prisoners of war. They also selected women, sometimes by the dozens, sometimes by the hundreds, who would be taken into the Khan's harem. For the Mongols, capturing women was more than just a prize to be taken in war. It was a way of controlling people. Look at the campaigns of Genghis Khan, for example. After beating his rivals, he made sure that his family and he had some of the best women. These weren't random abductions. They were deliberate choices. A princess from a different clan was not just beautiful. She was a bargaining chip in the political arena. By sleeping under the same roof as the Khan, she made sure that her family was taken into the Mongol world order in a symbolic and sometimes literal way. It was a harsh kind of diplomacy, a mix of taking control and feeling forced to be close. But capture didn't always mean elevation. For every noble woman that was taken as a mistress, many more ordinary people, servants and slaves, were forced into the lowest levels of the harem. Some were destined for lives of obscurity, their names never recorded, their roles reduced to the endless cycle of serving, entertaining, and being forgotten. To them, conquest meant losing their identity and becoming just another face in the crowd. But the presence of these women strengthens the empire. A harem in Karakoram or later in Beijing could be like a living map of Mongol victories. You might see a Turk beauty from Samarkand, a Song Korsha from Zhou, a Russian captive from Ryazan, and a Persian noble from Isfahan. Everyone was seated in the same hall, speaking different languages, but they were all in the same situation. Each one proved that no wall, city, or dynasty could stop the Mongols. But even in these tough times, there were sometimes chances to make things better. A woman who was not officially married to a Khan could become important by getting the Khan's attention and using this to gain influence for herself or her family. Conquest created victims, yes, but it also created unlikely players in the grand game of empire. The harem was not just a prison. Sometimes it was a ladder, but one that had been built using violence and control. Not every woman in the Mongol harems was taken by force. Sometimes they arrived wrapped in silk, with servants, and presented like jewels in a box. These were the daughters and sisters of kings and governors. They survived by resisting. Sending a woman to the Mongol court was a practical way to make peace. This was often the difference between keeping a throne and losing it. For rulers facing the unstoppable cavalry, tribute wasn't just gold or horses. A daughter could be the best way to keep the Mongol armies happy. Picture this. A messenger is going into the king's court. He bows low and offers the king his most valuable item, a royal lady dress to show off her wealth and roots. At that moment, she became both a hostage and a bridge. She was a living treaty that tied her homeland to the empire's will. The Mongols understood how important these gestures were. A concubine, a woman who lives with a man but is not his wife, given as tribute wasn't just a wife or servant. She was proof that another ruler accepted the power of the Mongols. The Khan could look across his harem and literally see the submission of nations. Every woman had a story about how her people survived or gave up. But here's the cruel irony. While some women were important, they were still bound by the harem's hierarchy. A princess from a powerful kingdom might have special treatment, nice clothes, and a say in court business, but she was not in control of her own life. Her presence reminded her homeland of how easily it could be attacked and of the important decision it had to make about who to be loyal to. Sometimes, these women even acted as informal ambassadors through letters, gifts, and secret influence. They stayed in touch with their families, carefully managing diplomacy from behind screens. Some used their positions to protect their people, negotiating to pay less tax or being less strict during rebellions. Others became pawns that were used as leverage when their relatives didn't fulfill their promises. For the Mongols, showing respect for women was a way to honor them that also made sense in practice. It made them stronger without any violence. For the rulers who sent them, it was both embarrassing and a last-ditch attempt to save their kingdom. Life in the Mongol harem was both luxurious and stifling. These were not simple households, but big, well-organized institutions. The harem might be found in a tent complex on the steppes or inside a palace in cities like Karakoram or later Kbalik. But the atmosphere was always the same, with lots of rules, rituals, and rivalries. Women were ranked based on where they were from and how much they were liked. At the top stood royal consorts, who were often wives chosen through formal marriage alliances. Below them came highborn concubines, often daughters of defeated rulers or tribute princesses. The people at the bottom were the nameless masses. They were slaves, entertainers, and servants who were caught during raids. Every woman knew her role, and every woman knew that this could change. Sometimes, all it took was a glance from the Khan. Every day was a bit of a puzzle. On one hand, there was luxury. Silks from China, jewels from Persia, and perfumes from India. Their meals were full of meat, dairy, and special food from abroad. The harem itself was often protected by eunuchs or loyal servants to keep it safe and secret. But even though it seems perfect, life can feel like being trapped. Women lived isolated from the outside world. They had to follow the Khan's orders, and their futures depended on what he wanted. But this quiet environment was not as quiet as it seemed. The harem was a place where there were a lot of political arguments. The plan was to catch the king's attention by making secret agreements with servants or spreading rumors to make rivals look bad. A woman who had a child with a man who was not her husband suddenly found herself in a higher social position. Her child might even be prepared for a leadership role. But if a woman's popularity faded, she could disappear from history. Her name could be removed from court records. But not all of his influence came from seduction or having children. Some women were powerful because they were clever, charming, or strong. They gave advice, listened, and sometimes tried to influence events, turning the harem into a subtle area of diplomacy. They could influence decisions that affected kingdoms, military campaigns, or the succession itself, even if they were hidden. For people from the outside, the harem was a world of mystery, filled with both wealth and danger. For those inside, it was a delicate game of survival. To thrive meant learning to be still, patient, and smart. Life in the Mongol harem was similar to life in the empire. It was ruthless, it was always growing, and it was always just about to fall or be taken over. If the battlefield was where Mongol generals clashed, the harem was where their mistresses fought their own battles, but in a different way. Rivalries flared up, new friendships were formed, and secrets were often more powerful than weapons. One smile from the Khan could make someone jealous, while a rude comment might lead to years of secret planning. At the heart of these rivalries was status. If the Khan liked you, it meant you would have a better home, better clothes, and most importantly, more influence. Women who were not married tried to win the love of their husbands so that they could have children. A son born of a favored mistress could one day become a prince or even a Kei-chin. This meant that every birth became a very important event, and every pregnancy was a battle with consequences for the whole empire. But being ambitious in the harem wasn't just about being a mother. Some women try to make friends with eunuchs, guards, or senior wives, using these connections to help them survive or get what they wanted. Others were good at getting information, knowing which rival had lost favor, which envoy had sent gifts, or which servant could be bribed to deliver a message at just the right moment. In a world where people often ignored what they said, knowledge was worth more than money. But these secret plans could also be very dangerous. A whisper of betrayal, a rumor of cheating, or an accusation of witchcraft could destroy a mistress in the blink of an eye. History tells us about women who disappeared without a trace, with no record of what happened to them. It's likely that they were caught up in the power struggles inside the royal palace. To people from the outside, the harem seemed like a beautiful and luxurious place. For those inside, it could feel like a chessboard where every move had to be carefully thought out, and every mistake could lead to disaster. What makes these rivalries so interesting is that they reflect the empire's larger struggles. Just as the Mongol princes were fighting for who would be the next emperor, and the generals were planning their next battles, the concubines were trying to get power, safety, and respect in their own small world. Their rivalries weren't just small arguments. They were similar to the Mongol court itself, but on a smaller scale. The women had to survive, and the risks were as high as on a battlefield. In this sense, the harem was not just a private space. It was a place where the empire's politics were discussed, and where secrets and competition were common. If being in a relationship with someone was a game of chance, then being a mom was the ultimate prize. In the Mongol Empire, having a son made a concubine more important. If a child cried in the harem, the woman who gave birth could suddenly become very important. In Mongol politics, family was everything. Every Khan wanted to have heirs. The official wives were often in charge, but the concubines who had sons could be just as powerful. If a king had a son, it might change who would be king after him. This could cause arguments between family members that spread to the court and battlefield. All of a sudden, important people like generals, ministers, and even foreign ambassadors had to take notice of a woman who, just a few weeks earlier, might have been ignored. Mothers of princes had special duties. They were expected to look after their child, make sure their servants were loyal, and sometimes even give political advice. While a boy was raised in the warrior traditions of the steppe, his mother was responsible for his early education, shaping his values and loyalties. Some of these concubines fought hard for their sons, tried to get them lands, armies, and titles. But there was a lot at stake. If a mistress's son was unsuccessful, was ignored, or lost a fight for power, both mother and child could be in danger. The Mongol Empire was known for its violent fights over power between princes, which resulted in many families being torn apart. For the women who gave birth to them, survival meant not only protecting their child, but also dealing with the cruel rivalries between the mothers. Some mothers achieved lasting power. History tells us that some of these women had a big say in who was chosen as king. Through secret messages, presents, and calm persuasion, they could decide the fate of the empire. Others faded into obscurity once their sons died young or failed to become part of the ruling elite. In the Mongol harem, being a mother was both good and bad. It was the only way for most concubines to have a say, but it was all down to whether their child would succeed. In a world where princes were threatened by daggers, being a mother was risky. The term concubines in the Mongol Empire refers to more than just women living behind veils and walls. They were symbols, carefully designed pieces of propaganda that reinforced the Khan's supremacy. Each concubine had her own story, capturing a city, surrendering a rival, or keeping a diplomatic treaty. A Mongol harem was like a picture of the whole empire. Picture what it would be like. A group of foreign ambassadors went to the king's palace for a special meeting. They were led past rooms filled with women who clearly came from different places. Turkish, Chinese, Persian, Russian, and Korean. Each bore the distinct marks of her homeland. These included embroidered robes, jewels shaped in regional styles, and hairstyles that spoke of far-off traditions. To the Mongols, this diversity was not chaos, but proof that their authority spanned continents. The harem was a living atlas, with each woman a pin on the map of conquest. This symbolism worked on many levels. In their own country, it made the Mongol nobles remember that the Khan was the strongest. He commanded not only men and armies, but also the beauty and bloodlines of the people he conquered. The message was even stronger for foreign diplomats. Your land may still exist, but your daughters are here. The Khan doesn't just rule territories. He is in charge of families, futures, and dynasties. The Mongols also had other women with them, which made them think of themselves as rulers of the world, chosen by the blue sky. Just as the empire took in craftsmen, scholars, and generals from all parts of Eurasia. It also took in women. The harem was not a treat for herself. It was a small example of a bigger idea, showing that the Mongols were thought to be the ones who would rule the world. This symbolism was very important to the women themselves. Many were stripped of their identities, renamed, and made into decorations for the empire. But for some people, that role also brought opportunities. A concubine might use her position to help her people or to influence policies that benefit them. This meant that the harem became a place of both imprisonment and importance in the building of the empire, where women played important but unwilling roles. A concubine was not just a friend. They were living trophies, symbols of conquest, and reminders of the Mongols' unending desire to dominate. The world could see how much empire cost in their faces. For every concubine who became important, many more disappeared from history. The Mongol harems were huge, and sometimes hundreds of women lived there. But most of them were not known to history. Their names were rarely written down, their faces forgotten, and their stories erased because the empire was so big. For these women, the most important thing was to survive, not to have an influence on others. The lesser concubines had a routine and were not seen. They did different jobs in the harem, like sewing, weaving, preparing food, or entertaining people with music and dance. Many never saw the Khan, let alone slept with him. For them, the grandeur of the harem was less about being fancy and more about being boring. Days went by, and the only things that happened were the small dramas of rivalry, illness, or the occasional promotion when a favored mistress lost her position. But being unknown was often safer than trying to be famous. If you want to be influential, you have to be careful. In the harem, enemies can be deadly. Rumors of witchcraft, disloyalty, or disrespect could lead to a woman being sent into exile or even worse. On the other hand, those who kept their heads down and blended into the background often lived long lives within the harem's protective walls. They were able to keep their identities secret, which protected them from the dangers of the plot. But surviving had its own costs. These women were forced to leave their homes and were made to give up their languages and traditions. They were made to become silent members of the Mongol court. They lived without their families and knew they would never go back to the lands they came from. For some people, the memory of home became a bit fuzzy. A lullaby they remembered a little bit, a recipe they had forgotten, a story from when they were children that they could no longer tell in their original language. But just surviving was a win. The Mongol Empire was a tough world where campaigns were brutal and politics ruthless. A woman who lived quietly in the countryside survived longer than soldiers, generals, and even princes who died in wars. History forgot about them, but these women showed how strong they were. Their lives show us that not all history is about big moments of war and politics. Sometimes it is written in silence, in the quiet persistence of those who endured without leaving their names behind. Survival was a triumph in itself, even in the shadow of an empire. The story of concubinage in the Mongol Empire is not just about her luxury or intrigue. It is a mirror showing how empires worked, how power was used, how politics were made, and how women became both pawns and players in a world dominated by conquest. For the Khan, concubines were more than just companions. They were symbols of legitimacy, tokens of diplomacy, and proof that no kingdom or people could resist the Mongol will. The harem, which was filled with women from across Eurasia, was a living monument. Every visitor could see this. This empire stretches farther than you can imagine. This made people think that the Mongol rule was universal, unstoppable, and destined to last. But for the women themselves, the legacy was more complicated. Some of these mistresses became very important, and their children became the next emperors. They also had a big influence on the decisions made by the government. Their children became princes, generals, and heirs to thrones. These women, who are often forgotten by name, had a big influence on the empire by being close to the people in charge. But for every woman who became influential, many others lived secret lives, their stories hidden from the public. What remains is the idea that they have a double existence as symbols and survivors, political tools, and human beings. They remind us that history is not only written by generals and kings, but also by ordinary people. Even when they were not named, concubines represented the ambitions of the empire and were a hidden cost of its expansion. The practice of concubinage also left its mark on the world beyond the Mongols. Later dynasties in China, Persia, and Central Asia adopted or expanded harem systems that were based on those used by the Mongols. The idea of women as instruments of power, as both spoils and guarantors of political order, became a part of the political culture of Eurasia long after the empire itself fell apart. In the end, the fact that there was a lot of covert and hidden relationships in the Mongol Empire makes us face up to something that is difficult to accept. The lives of those who took part in the conquest were shaped by being held captive, wanting to achieve things, and trying to stay alive. The Kun traveled across continents, changing the world. But the women in their harems carried that story in their bodies and their silence. They were the human cost of empire and its most enduring symbols. Step into Victorian London, and the first thing you notice isn't how grand the buildings are, or even the smog that hung over the city. It's the smell of the food. Every big street, alley, and marketplace was also a kitchen. You could get food in more places than just pubs and tea rooms. It spilled out into the streets, was carried on carts with squeaky wheels, balanced in baskets on the arms of hawkers, and cooked over small charcoal braziers right on the pavement. For working-class Londoners who did not have ovens at home, this street economy was very important. Most people living in slums did not have a full kitchen. Even boiling water could be difficult. Street food filled that gap. A few pennies could buy a hot, filling meal that spared families the need to cook in smoky rooms. Eating from the street was not a treat. It was necessary. The streets were full of food stalls. Hawkers shouted rhymes and catchy cries to draw customers. Hot pies or chestnuts that are warm. These weren't just sales pitches. They were part of the city's soundtrack, which was made up of the sounds of horses, factories, and crowds of people moving through London. If you walked down Cheapside, Whitechapel, or the Strand, you would have been surrounded by a symphony of smells and sounds, with each hawker trying to catch your attention. But there was another side to this busy kitchen. It's about cleanliness or the lack of it. Food was often prepared in large amounts in dirty conditions, carried in open baskets, or put out on stalls where cold soot and flies could come in. But for many Londoners, the choice wasn't between clean and dirty. It was between eating something that might be bad for me or going hungry. In the Victorian era, street food culture was closely linked to the city's daily routine. It was quick, cheap, loud, and easy to get to. From the dock worker grabbing a meat pie between work shifts to children collecting coins to buy a bag of roasted potatoes together, the streets provided what kitchens couldn't. In a society where people were divided by wealth and class, the food sellers of London mixed things up, feeding everyone who had a penny to spare. The streets weren't just for walking. They were the places where the locals dined. If there was one type of street food that everyone loved in Victorian times, it was the hot pie. To the tired worker going home after a 10-hour shift, or the busy shopper on their way to work, there is nothing better for satisfying their hunger or more affordable than a hot pie bought from a food stall. These pies weren't fancy snacks for the drawing room. They were strong, small meals that were easy to carry and designed to help people survive when they were out and about. The pies came in all sorts of shapes and sizes. Meat pies were the most common, but the meat in them could be anything. Some were stuffed with minced beef or mutton, but cheaper versions often used cheaper fillers like gristle, potatoes, or turnips. You didn't ask many questions because it cost just 1 penny. You just hoped for something warm and filling. More wealthy customers might buy a V and oyster pie, a treat that combined luxury with affordability. This shows how street food could cater to both the working poor and the middle class. There were street pie sellers everywhere, moving around with tins that kept their pies hot. These devices looked like miniature fireplaces on wheels, with smoke coming up as the seller shouted, "Pies are all hot, very hot." The cries became a symbol of London. Anyone visiting the city's busy streets would easily be able to recognize them. Some sellers have even built loyal followings. Their customers know their names and trust them to make pies that are of a similar quality to those made by less reputable competitors. But even though hot pies were very popular, they also had a bad reputation. People who wanted to change things and writers often said that food was not pure, and pies were often thought to be the food that was most often not pure. The press loved horror stories about cat or dog meat being found in fillings, which made people worried about the city's dirty food supply. While many of these stories were exaggerated, they show the tension between the joy of a warm meal and the uncertainty of what exactly one was eating. But the hot pie continued to be popular because it met the needs of the time. In a busy city full of people, factories, and long hours, the pie was easy to carry, filling, and cheap. It wasn't fancy food, but it was cheap, filling, and it fed the Victorian workforce. In many ways, it was the perfect example of what you can find on the streets of London. If hot pies were the most popular food all year round, roasted chestnuts were the star of the show in Victorian London. As the days got shorter and the fog got thicker, the strong, smoky smell of chestnuts roasting over open fires drifted through the streets. It was the smell of winter in the city, like a perfume that you could eat. Chestnut sellers set up on corners and busy streets, their simple stalls marked by little iron pans or braziers glowing with hot coals. For just 1 penny, you could walk away with a warm paper cone filled with chestnuts. Their shells would be charred, and their flesh would be soft and nutty. For poor Londoners with numb fingers and no food, the chestnut was more than just food. It was just the heat. Customers put their hands on the cone before eating it. It was a small but precious comfort in the cold of Victorian winters. The trade was often run by the very poor, many of whom were women and children. For some people, selling chestnuts was the only way to avoid starvation. All you need is a brazier, fuel, and a supply of nuts, and you can use it anywhere there are people. Railway stations, markets, and theater districts were the best places to find sellers, as customers rushed out of evening shows. Chestnuts were also seen as one of the safer street foods. Pies can hide anything inside their crusts, but chestnuts were roasted in their shells right in front of you. They didn't need complicated storage, and it was hard to change the amount of them. People who want to change things sometimes said that chestnuts were a good example of honest, fair, simple, clean, and nourishing food. But even here, there were signs that life was difficult. Sellers often worked long hours in the cold, their faces covered in cold dust, their hands rough from using hot pans. For customers, the warm cone was a short-lived comfort. For sellers, it was a fight to survive, 1 penny at a time. People really liked roasted chestnuts. They even became a part of Victorian literature and art. Charles Dickens wrote about them and said that their smell filled London streets in winter. They were more than just a snack. They showed that the people of the city were all the same. It's a cheap food that the poor can enjoy, but it's also fancy enough for the middle classes. In a city where there was a lot of inequality, roasted chestnuts were one of the few treats that everyone could enjoy. If roasted chestnuts were the highlight of winter evenings, then eel stalls were the heart and soul of working-class London. For the poorest people in the city, eels weren't just something to eat. They were survival food, cheap and easy to get. The eel was one of the most popular foods on Victorian street corners. This was because it was easy to prepare and inexpensive. People who sell eels set up basic wooden stalls or work from trolleys. They displayed trays of eels, some still alive, some already cut into pieces and cooking in big iron pots. For a few pennies, a hungry worker could buy a serving of jellied eels, boiled until their natural gelatin set into a wobbly, glistening mass. For those who like strong tastes, stewed eels simmered in pepper and vinegar were a treat. Either way, they provided protein at a price no butcher could match. The stalls were full of people who didn't have much money. Dock workers, factory workers, and costumers stood closely together, eating food standing up or taking it home in small containers. Unlike pies or chestnuts, which were snacks, eels were a meal. They were cheap, filling, and sustaining enough to carry a man through another exhausting day. But eel stalls weren't just about food. They were places where people met and socialized. People of all ages mixed together, chatting while they ate. The air smelt of vinegar. There was the sound of pots bubbling and people shouting prices. In a city where class divisions are very obvious, eel stalls were one of the few places where poverty was clearly visible, but also felt shared by everyone, and where people helped each other to survive. The popularity of eel stalls also showed how unhealthy Victorian diets were. It cost a lot of money to buy meat. In poor neighborhoods, bread was often made with chalk or alum, and there was not much variety of vegetable. Eels filled the gap, offering nourishment where other foods had failed. There were lots of them, and this made the prices low. But later, overfishing and pollution made things worse. To people who didn't know better, eel stalls might have seemed horrible. But for many people in London, they were lifelines, offering not just food, but also a sense of community. They were the perfect example of Victorian street food. It is practical, affordable, and based on the needs of everyday life. Hot pies and eels fed the stomach, but penny ice creams and sugary street snacks fed the soul. By the mid-9th century, London streets were full of the sounds of food sellers and sweet sellers. These treats offered a break from the daily routine for both children and adults. The most famous of these was penny ice cream. Before refrigeration was common, street vendors carried ice mixed with saltpeter to keep their sweets cold. Ice cream was scooped into small glasses that could be used more than once. Sometimes these glasses were rinsed quickly before being given to the next customer. It wasn't the best Italian ice cream, but for a penny, Londoners were happy. The flavors were lemon and strawberry, and some strange mixes of milk and sugar syrup that were more like ice cream. Despite being dirty, penny ice was very popular, especially in summer when it made busy streets like the one on Oxford Street look like a fun fair. But ice cream wasn't the only sweet treat on offer. Hawkers sold sweets like toffee drops, trickle sticks, candied nuts, and peppermint rock. Children whose parents didn't have much money would chew licorice roots, even though it only cost a few pennies. People sell things on the street. They have trays on their shoulders. They walk through busy streets. They make noise to attract attention. They have bells, or they make noises that sound like sing-song. It was common to see children pressing their noses against trays of sweets. In Victorian London, these sugary snacks had a powerful symbolism. For the poor, they were luxuries that were easy to get, small treats that made life easier. But for people who wanted to change things, these things meant that morals were getting worse. They thought that children were being tempted by easy pleasures and that this was stopping them from being careful with money and showing discipline. Newspapers sometimes warned people about adulterated sweets colored with poisonous dyes, which made people even more worried about buying sweets. But penny ice creams and sugary snacks were still popular because they were more than just a way to satisfy a craving. They made people happy, even if it was only for a short time. In neighborhoods where children worked as street sellers themselves, selling things like matches or newspapers, spending a penny on ice cream was about more than just the taste. It was about being a child, in a city where they were often refused. Sugary treats may not have been very healthy, but they were important for other reasons. They gave people hope, made them happy, and made them want to enjoy small things in life. In Victorian London, street food wasn't just about eating. It was also about drinking. The sounds of people selling pies and roasting chestnuts filled the air, along with the sound of bottles clinking and steam rising from kettles. Drinking was a big part of street culture. They offer refreshment, warmth, or sometimes a cheap buzz. One of the most popular drinks was ginger beer. Victorian ginger beer was often fermented, which made it slightly alcoholic. It was sold in strong glass bottles with cork stoppers. It was tangy, fizzy, and just sweet enough to appeal to children and adults alike. People sold it from carts or shops that only sold this spicy drink. For people who didn't have much money, ginger beer was a refreshing choice instead of water, which was often not safe to drink. It felt like a treat, even though it only cost a penny a glass. Another important part of Victorian street life were the coffee stalls. They appeared on street corners before sunrise, selling food to workers on their way to factories and docks. These stalls were simple setups, usually a hand cart with a brass urn on top, with steam coming off it into the morning air. A worker could buy a cup of coffee with a half penny or a penny, even if they were tired and couldn't see well. The coffee was often very weak and sweetened with molasses. It wasn't as good as a cafe, but it was hot. And in the cold fog that often shrouds London in the mornings, that was more important than taste. Alongside coffee, stalls often sold bread rolls, boiled eggs, or slices of cake, making them a kind of early fast food breakfast spot. They were very popular, especially with the city's growing number of people who worked nights and needed food at different times. These stalls were a mix of practical and fun, offering cheap and easy ways to relax in a city that never stopped. People who don't like the smell of ginger beer and coffee didn't like the stalls selling them. People who wanted to change things worried that ginger beer was encouraging children to drink too much alcohol. Those who cared about morals thought that spending too much time at coffee shops was bad for them and could even lead to crime. But they were still popular. For many Londoners, these drinks were not a luxury. They were a normal part of everyday life. In the busy streets of Victorian London, people were always on the go and drinking. Sharp, hot, fizzy, and flowing. If you close your eyes in Victorian London, you could still tell where you were. I heard the voices of the street vendors, not the noise of the carriage wheels or the foghorns on the trains. Their cries were like the music of the city, loud and clear, even in the fog and smoke, telling people about the food they sold with rhymes, songs, and shouts that were as unique as the food itself. The people selling things tried really hard to get people to buy things. A pie seller might shout, "Piesy's all hot, piping hot." A chestnut hawker sang, "Chestnuts all warm and ready." These weren't just advertisements. They were performances that had been improved over time until the very sound became associated with the food. Londoners didn't just hear words. They heard melodies that made them hungry. Children would rush towards the familiar cry of the ice cream man, while tired workers perked up at the booming call of the coffee stall keeper. Each vendor had their own style. Some people used humor to make fun of customers or rivals. Others relied on rhythm, repeating phrases like chants until they could be heard across the alleyways. The most famous of these cries became well-known and were used in newspapers, novels, and even funny plays. Charles Dickens himself often wrote about these cries because he knew that they were an important part of what the city was. For the people selling things, The cries were a way of making a living. Competition on busy streets was tough, and without a loud and memorable call, a seller could easily be ignored. A sharp, catchy cry could mean the difference between going home with money or going home empty-handed. Some of the people selling things even hired children to call for them, because their high-pitched voices can be heard better than adult voices in the noise. But the cries were more than just business. They created a sense of community. The neighbors noticed the same people coming and going at certain times of day, and their voices created a rhythm of daily life. A coffee seller's early morning call might wake everyone in a neighborhood, while an evening shout from a man selling something else would be a signal that it was time for dinner. To modern ears, the constant shouting might sound chaotic. But to people in Victorian times, it was a normal part of life in the city, as important as church bells or factory whistles. The cries of street vendors made London's big food market more than just a place to buy things. They turned it into a theater, a memory and sound. A crowd of people calling out as they walk along the stone streets. Even though Victorian street food looked and tasted amazing, there was a problem. It might be dangerous. In the past, before we had modern food safety standards, people like reformers, doctors, and journalists were often warning that cheap food might fill stomachs, but could also spread disease. The problem started with hygiene. Vendors worked outside. There was coal, soot, horse manure, and industrial smoke around them. The food was exposed to flies and dust, and many hawkers did not have access to clean water. Coffee stalls often reused the same mugs all day, rinsing them in a single dirty bucket between customers. Penny ice creams, which are usually served in shared glasses, might be licked by a dozen people before being wiped clean with a cloth and given to the next excited child. Then there was adulteration, which is when ingredients are stretched to save money. Pies sometimes had more turnip than meat, if meat was even in them. Sweets were made brighter using toxic dyes like lead chromate or copper sulfate. Bread, which is not usually considered street food, was often made with chalk or alum, and people who wanted to change the way food was made thought the same things might be happening with street snacks. To people who were already poor, this was not just dishonest, it was also very dangerous. People who were trying to make changes to healthcare and society were quick to spot these problems. The newspapers wrote exciting stories about what might be inside a penny pie, like horse meat or even cats and dogs being cut up to make fillings. While some of these stories were exaggerated, they showed real worries about where street food comes from. People like Henry Mayhew, who wrote about London's poor, described how vendors were finding it hard to make a living. But despite the warnings, street food was still very popular. For the poor, it was still very important. A plate of eels or a handful of chestnuts was better than nothing. And for many, there simply was no other option. Even the middle classes, though careful, sometimes enjoyed street treats when they thought they were convenient or reminded them of the past. In a way, Victorian street food culture was a mix of necessity and danger. Even though the people who wanted to make changes might have shouted, the people in London carried on buying things. This meant that they were able to balance the risk of getting sick against the fact that they would definitely go hungry. It was a risk taken every day in every alley where smoke rose from a hawker's brazier. Though the cries of hawkers have long faded and the cold braziers are cold, the legacy of Victorian street food still influences Britain's culinary culture. Survival food for the poor started the ball rolling for customs that are still important today and have had a big impact on how London and the rest of the country eat. Take the criticism on the chin. In the past, it was common to see a penny hawker's cart. This evolved into the long-lasting tradition of the pie and mash shop, which can still be found in some parts of London. The jellied eel, created because of the need to use cheap ingredients, is still a dish that represents the East End. It is a sign of tradition, not of necessity. Even the penny ice cream served in shared glasses to messy children showed that the popularity of mass-produced ice creams was growing. These would soon become a summer treat, loved by many across Britain. But Victorian street food had a bigger impact than just the dishes. It made people think about how easy it is to eat food that is already made. The idea that you could buy a hot meal quickly and cheaply without going to a pub or waiting for service was revolutionary. It started a way of eating that continued into the 20th century with fish and chip shops, cafes, and then the fast food industry. The streets of Victorian London were where modern gastropubs first started. The legacy is also cultural. Street vendors with their cries and rhymes gave London its soundtrack, and food became a big part of what the city was known for. Writers like Dickens made them famous, showing how important street food was to city life. If you read about Victorian London without its hawkers, it would be like imagining the city without fog or cobblestones. At the same time, the health problems that affected Victorian street food led to lasting changes. Scandals about adulterated sweets and unsafe practices eventually led governments to enact food safety laws, which laid the foundation for modern consumer protections. The tension between necessity, pleasure, and safety that defined Victorian street eating is still relevant today in debates over processed foods, additives, and fast food culture. In the end, Victorian street food was more than just something to eat. It was about survival, community, theater, and tradition. Its delicious flavors fed a city that was changing, and its legacy is still there every time Londoners buy a hot snack to eat on the go. The streets may be quieter now, but the memories of those vendors still haunt the modern marketplace, reminding us that even the simplest foods can shape history. The story of the California Gold Rush starts quietly, almost by accident, in January 1848. James Marshall, a carpenter who was supervising building work at Sutter's Mill on the American River, saw something shiny in the water. At first, it seemed unimportant, just another strange thing to see. But the word spread quickly, and what started as a small talk in a sawmill town became one of the biggest migrations in history. By the summer of 1848, California, which was still officially a remote territory, was full of people looking for gold. News spread quickly across the continent. Sailors and merchants told each other about it, and letters also helped to spread the news. Newspapers were quick to pick up on the story, promising people they would get rich by digging up the land. By 1849, the small group of people looking for their fortune had grown into a huge wave. They became known as the 49ers, a group of all sorts of people: farmers, adventurers, laborers, and dreamers. They packed their belongings and set out for the West. They came from everywhere. Americans traveled across the country in covered wagons, crossing deserts and mountains. Ships set sail from Latin America, Australia, and even China, full of passengers willing to take a chance at becoming rich. San Francisco, a small village, changed quickly into a busy town. It had tents, bars, and shops. Its harbor was full of abandoned ships. Their crews had left to chase gold further up the river. But the rush was never just about the shiny objects. People brought with them recipes, tools, and traditions that came together in the rough frontier. As well as the gold pans, they brought Dutch ovens, rice cookers, and coffee pots. Every small town needed people to cook, bake, and brew beer. Every small town also needed people to grow food. Very quickly, a new food culture started to emerge. It was improvised, chaotic, and nothing like the polished refinement of Victorian dining rooms back east. Many people went to the West in search of instant wealth, but they soon discovered that reality was not as easy as they had hoped. It was rare to find a lot of money. It was inevitable that he would strike while he was hungry. There were a lot of people and not much infrastructure, so there were shortages, high prices, and people had to make do with what they had. To understand the gold rush, You have to understand desire for riches and the daily struggle to eat, cook, and survive in a world where civilization itself seemed half-built. People were rushing to get gold, but the same was true of the scramble for food. The dream of getting rich quickly collided with the reality of eating like a prospector. In the mining camps of California, meals were about survival, not taste. The frontier diet was basic, monotonous, and for many, very sad. There was always a shortage of food, prices were very high, and preparing meals was often as hard as the men themselves. Flour was a key part of a miner's diet. It was the basic ingredient for everything from flapjacks fried on a skillet to rough loaves of bread baked in Dutch ovens buried under hot coals. Flour was very valuable, so much so that a single barrel could cost as much as gold, literally. Next came beans, dried, salted, and boiled for hours. They were full and happy without spending too much money. Coffee, usually bitter and burnt, was the lifeblood of the camps. People drank it quickly at night under their lanterns before going out to dig and pan for gold, but there was not much choice. In the early years, it was really hard to find fresh fruit and vegetables, especially in remote camps. Miners often went weeks without eating anything green. Scurvy, a disease caused by a lack of vitamin C, was common in the camps. It caused bleeding gums and aching joints. Sometimes people who are looking for gold find onions or potatoes that have been shipped in at very high prices. When they couldn't, they would eat salted pork or dried fish, which were easy to travel with but not very tasty. People usually cooked together in groups. Camps got their resources together, and one unlucky person was chosen to be the cook. This person was often chosen not because they were good at cooking, but because they had lost a bet or been picked last in a game. Food was eaten quickly and without much thought. A child might have beans for breakfast, bread, and beans for lunch, and if they were lucky, beans with a bit of pork for dinner. People often complained, but because they were working really hard, they didn't care as much about the taste of food as they did about having enough energy to work. But even though everything was the same, food showed how hard life was on the frontier. Every cup of coffee, every spoonful of beans was important and had to be made carefully. For men who had crossed deserts, oceans, and mountains chasing gold, eating was no feast. It was a daily reminder that in California, survival was more important than making money. If digging for gold was hard work, paying for food was even harder. The California gold rush led to one of the most chaotic food economies in American history, where there was a lot of scarcity and opportunity. Miners might not find gold, but merchants selling food like flour, bacon, and eggs often became richer than the men working in a river. The problem began with the numbers. Lots of people moved to California very quickly, but there weren't enough farms, mills, or supply chains to support them. All the flour and beans had to be transported overland across the Rockies or around Cape Horn on a month-long sea voyage. By the time it reached the mining camps, prices had shot up. In the early years, reports said the costs were extremely high. A single egg could be worth up to $1, which is more than $30 today. When potatoes, onions, or apples appeared, they were treated like treasure. Sometimes, they were sold at auction to the person willing to pay the most money. Coffee was so expensive that some camps reused grounds multiple times, each brew weaker than the last. A loaf of bread might cost a fortune in gold dust, and fresh butter was almost like a mythical thing outside of San Francisco. These shortages had a big effect on what miners could eat. Many miners had to eat beans, bacon, and bread every day because they had no other food. They did not choose to eat this food. They had to. When supplies got low, some people did desperate things. They traded tools or even clothes for a few pounds of flour. Others relied on hunting and fishing. Eventually, There was not much wild game left because thousands of people were fighting over the same food and other things they needed to survive. At the same time, there was a new kind of prospector, the entrepreneurial cook and merchant. Smart people realized that feeding miners was often more profitable than mining itself. Camp cooks set up basic food stalls, selling simple meals at very high prices. Entrepreneurs brought food into camps using mule trains, charging whatever the market would allow. And the market would allow almost anything. The result was an economy based on food, not gold. There was not enough food for everyone, so every meal was a gamble. Would you spend your dust on a real dinner or save it to buy more digging supplies? In a land where people dream of being rich, hunger reminded everyone that money is no good if you are hungry. The gold rush was not just an American story. It was a global issue. By 1850, San Francisco and the mining camps were full of people from all over the world, including Mexico, Chile, Peru, China, Australia, and Europe, who were looking for their fortune. They didn't just bring picks and shovels. They brought recipes, ways of cooking and taste that made eating in the frontier areas much more varied than just beans and bacon. One of the most visible influences came from Latin America. Chilean and Mexican miners introduced dishes that include beans, tortillas, and spicy meats. Chili peppers, which were not really used in Anglo-American cooking at the time, were used in stews and sauces, which made meals more exciting than just boiled beans. Tamales, corn dough stuffed with meat wrapped in husks and steamed, became a common sight, sold in towns and mining camps. Then, in the early 1850s, thousands of Chinese immigrants arrived. They brought with them rice, soy sauce, dried mushrooms, and ways to cook them quickly in a wok. In a place where there was not much variety, Chinese food stood out because it was tasty and creative. Even the most doubtful miners were impressed by their ability to make good meals with few supplies. Though discrimination often forced Chinese communities to live in separate areas, their food spread outwards, leaving an everlasting mark on California's cuisine. People from Europe added their own personal touches. Italians baked crusty breads and introduced pasta. French immigrants opened bakeries in San Francisco, bringing pastries and cafe culture to the city. Germans made beer and sausages, which were healthier than salt pork. Even Australians got involved, adapting recipes for their own harsh conditions by drawing on their own experiences of living in the frontier. What made this food culture so special was that people were always coming up with new ideas. Because ingredients were expensive and hard to find, immigrants often used local products or mixed different traditions. A Chinese cook might use soy and ginger to season wild game. A miner from Mexico might use corn from California to make tortillas. What people ended up with was not a traditional old-style meal, but a simple mix that was easy to make and suited to the gold rush environment. These exchanges made frontier life easier to live. They made people feel happy and proud of their culture, even though they were far from home in a place that was sometimes unkind. Even more importantly, they started California becoming a place where different types of food from all over the world are enjoyed. Long before fusion became a popular word in cooking, it was being used by miners and migrants during the gold rush. One tamale, one bowl of rice, one loaf of bread at a time. When miners arrived in California, basic camps quickly became busy towns. The first real restaurants and bars also appeared. For men tired of eating beans boiled over campfires, these places offered not just food and drink, but a taste of civilization, though often at an expensive price. San Francisco became the place where this new dining culture started. By the early 1850s, the once quiet port had become a busy city full of places to eat for every budget and taste. The best restaurants served huge meals with lots of courses. They imported food from all over the world, including oysters from the east coast of America, champagne from France, and exotic fruits from Hawaii. For the rich, eating out was a way to show off how well they were doing, as well as a way to stop them from feeling hungry. But most places were much more modest. Saloon was the name given to a type of building that was very common in the frontier. These buildings were used as restaurants, bars, and places where people could meet and socialize. A miner could come in after a long day and order a plate of steak, bread, and potatoes if he had the money. More often, bars served simple stews, fried fish, or salted pork, with strong whiskey or beer to wash it down. The food was quick, loud, and everyone ate together. The tables were long and sticky with spilled drinks. Prices were very high. Eating out in San Francisco can be very expensive. One meal could cost as much as some children earn in a few days. But people still wanted them. After weeks of eating the same thing for every meal, the chance to eat something freshly prepared and, more importantly, to eat in company was irresistible. Restaurants and bars became places where men hung out, gambled, talked about what was going on in their town and their country, and made business deals. They talk a lot, and they're always talking about how they want to be rich. Many business owners realized that feeding miners was often more profitable than mining itself. People who made bread, beer, and meat quickly became some of the richest people in the gold rush economy. Levi Strauss made his money from denim trousers, but there were many others who made their money selling bread, beer, or hearty meals to hungry 49ers. These early places had a big impact. They created the foundation for California's restaurant culture, mixing European, American, and immigrant traditions in a lively and energetic setting. In the end, saloons and restaurants were more than just places to eat. They were where miners reconnected with other people, even as the wild area of the gold rush was just beyond the town. The gold rush was often a very male-dominated world, with rowdy bars, muddy camps, and a lot of digging. But women also had a big impact on food culture at that time. Though there were not as many of them as men, women found work not in the mines, but in the kitchens, bakeries, and boarding houses that fed the fortune hunters. In many cases, they earned more from cooking than most men did from panning gold. At first, the fact that there were so few women gave them a special advantage. A woman who could cook a good meal, bake bread, or wash clothes could command a high price. Women's boarding houses quickly became popular places for miners who needed more than just beans and bacon. A warm stew, a slice of pie, and a clean table offered some of the things money could buy, but only if you found a woman willing to provide them. Many entrepreneurial women took this chance. Some of them started small bakeries, selling bread at higher prices. Others ran kitchens where they served hearty meals to lines of miners, charging in gold dust instead of coins. For them, cooking wasn't just a job, it was a business. Instead of searching the riverbeds for gold, they made a regular profit by satisfying the hunger of thousands. Women also made the rough frontier diet more sophisticated. They used family recipes to make things like pies filled with fruit or roasts seasoned with herbs. Even small things like fresh bread or a cup of tea could remind miners of home. These meals were very important because they made the miners feel better when they were feeling unsure and worried while they were working in the mines. The presence of women also changed how society worked. Boarding houses run by women were often calmer, cleaner, and more disciplined than rowdy saloons. The meals, they were always very organized. The tables have been set, prayers have been said, and food has been served politely. For many men, it was the first time they had been at home for years, and it made them think about the world they had left behind. Though there were not many of them, the women made a lasting impact. They provided miners with food and helped them to become economically independent, despite the fact that many people did not give them opportunities to do so. In many cases, it was women's cooking, not gold mining, that helped build stable communities across California. Even though the gold rush diet was hard, with food like beans, bacon, and bitter coffee, meals were an important part of life for the people who lived and worked in mining communities. People would meet around campfires in the Sierra Nevada mountains or in simple huts by the rivers. Food was more than just something to keep us going. It was a chance to chat, learn about different cultures, and enjoy a daily routine. This reminded the miners that they were human and not just workers in a world obsessed with gold. Camps were places where different cultures and ideas mixed together. People from all over the world came together to eat, which was a great opportunity for them to share their cultures. A young person from Mexico might add chili peppers to beans, while a French immigrant showed his friends how to make a simple stew with onions and herbs. Chinese workers cooked rice with dried fish and vegetables. The neighbors, who were hungry, quickly learned to like the unfamiliar tastes. These culinary borrowings mixed together different types of food, creating hybrid dishes that reflected the diversity of California's population. It was also practical to share meals with other people. Cooking individually meant that precious fuel and ingredients were wasted, so miners often had to take supplies with them. One person might bring flour, another might bring bacon, and someone else might bring coffee. Together, they can mix everything together to make a shared pot of food. The food might not have been fancy, but it brought people together in camps where feeling lonely and tired was really common. Food was also an important part of celebrations. On special holidays like Independence Day or Christmas, miners worked really hard to prepare big meals. They saved up flour for pies, bought rare meat, or treated themselves to luxury items from the town. These meals were important emotional moments when the tough life of mining gave way to fun and memory. Even when things are hard, food can make us happy, or at least make us laugh. People often made fun of camp cooks. They praised them when the beans weren't burned, but cursed them when they were. There were stories about famous cooks whose food was so bad that it made men want to go back to mining jobs early. In a strange way, complaining about food became part of camp culture, a shared grumble that reminded everyone they were all in the same situation. Eating together helped bring a group of people who were looking for their fortune closer together and make them more like a community. Around campfires and basic tables, miners stopped looking for gold for a while. They share not just a meal, but also a moment of human connection. The gold rush was full of stories of wealth, but there was also a less happy side. They were always hungry, and when there was not enough, people took advantage of each other. In the rush to feed thousands, food supplies became tainted, adulterated, and full of fraud. This meant that eating became as risky as panning for gold. First, there was a time of no food. When the rush began, California didn't have the farms or the infrastructure to support all the newcomers. Ships brought goods from all over the world, but sometimes there were delays, storms, or shortages. This meant that miners in some areas had no flour, coffee, or meat for weeks at a time. When supplies started to run low, people got desperate. Prices went up a lot, and people with food stockpiled it or sold it for much more than it was worth. For the poorest people, hunger was a constant worry, even as they worked. It was only to be expected that fraud would happen in these circumstances. Some dishonest traders took advantage of poor miners by selling them flour that was mixed with plaster or chalk, coffee that was mixed with ground acorns, or butter that was mixed with lard. Salt pork might be half rancid by the time it reached a camp, but people were still willing to pay a lot of money for it. Even tinned goods, a relatively new invention, were sometimes tampered with. Labels that say oysters or fruit, but which actually contain other, less appealing foods. Adulteration wasn't always a bad thing. Sometimes it was just something that happened because they needed to. Bakers might stretch bread dough with sawdust or ground beans to make supplies last longer. The brewers made the beer weaker by adding water to it. But whether they did it to be greedy or just to survive, it didn't matter. Food that made miners feel sick or angry. People noticed these practices. Newspapers in San Francisco published stories warning readers about dishonest food sellers and urging them to be careful. But for men who lived deep in the hills, far from town markets, there was not much choice. If a man was hungry, he would eat whatever was put in front of him, no matter how bad it was. The problem with gold rush food culture is that it shows us that being rich can be dangerous. Just as men gambled with their lives in collapsing tunnels and raging rivers, they also gambled with every meal, hoping the bread wasn't chalky, the beans weren't spoiled, and the coffee wasn't made from sawdust. In a land obsessed with gold, even food became another area where people tried to trick others. When the gold rush ended in the mid-1850s, many miners left California without finding any gold. But the food culture that started in those years is still around today. Instead, it left a lasting legacy that shaped California's culinary identity and even influenced America's eating habits in general. The most immediate impact was on the economy. People who sold things, baked goods, made beer, and ran restaurants often did really well during the gold rush. Their businesses survived the boom and became permanent features of San Francisco and other places. People realized that feeding people could make more money than digging for gold. This was a very important lesson for business on the frontier. The first successful breweries, bakeries, and restaurants in California started in these early years. The gold rush made California a place where different cultures met. People from Mexico, Chile, China, Italy, France, and Germany had all brought their own recipes to the camps and towns. These traditions didn't just disappear. They joined together, changed a bit, and became a part of California's food scene. Chinese cooks introduced rice and stir-fry techniques. It was the Mexican miners who made tamales and chili popular. Europeans brought bread, beer, and pastries. The idea of blending different types of food, which is now closely linked with California, first happened when people cooked over campfires. The gold rush also brought new ideas about convenience and portability to American food culture. Food had to be quick to make, filling, and able to last in bad weather. This focus on practicality paved the way for later American staples like canned goods, diners, and eventually fast food. The busy, hectic lifestyle of the miners led to a new way of eating. This way was all about speed and getting energy, not how nice food looked. Even the darker aspects, like fraud and adulteration, led to change. People were also concerned about the use of plaster and flour or sawdust in bread. This led to more calls for food safety reforms. It would take decades, but the groundwork was laid for consumer protections that reshaped how Americans trusted what they ate. Most of all, the gold rush showed how hunger played a big part in history, just as much as gold did. The miners who gathered around campfires, sharing beans, bread, or tamales, forged communities in a chaotic land. The people of California are known for their ability to improvise, their resilience, and their cultural exchange. These qualities have become the foundation of the state's unique food culture. Today, when you walk through San Francisco's Chinatown, eat a Mission-style burrito, or drink a California craft beer, you're tasting the effects of the gold rush. The gold may have been short-lived, but the flavors it brought to California are still there today.